Okay, so we are going to go ahead and talk about reflexes a little bit. You all had a ton of questions about that in your discussion boards, so I'm going to go ahead and give a lecture over this section of it. So let us get started. Okay, first of all, here we go. All right. So what exactly is a reflex? It is an automatic response to a stimulus that occurs without conscious thought. So it kind of fits into that homeostasis that we talked about. Clearly, if you step on a thumbtack, you are not in a state of homeostasis. So your body has a reflex to make you recoil your foot to remove the thumbtack from it and hopefully fix that problem. That's why it's considered homeostatic. But it's also something that you don't think about. So the first thing I'd like to mention, I usually do a demonstration of this in class when it comes to reflexes. You can't train your reflexes to do anything. So if I were to throw a ball at you, would it be your reflex if it's coming up at your face to catch it? Yes, because you're trying not to hurt yourself, but overall, no, it's not really a reflex because it is a conscious effort for you to put your hand up and not get hit in the face with a ball. Are some people faster than others? Yes, you can actually train yourself to be faster in certain movements. Over time with lots of practice, but it's not a reflex. The moment you have a conscious thought about something, it is no longer a reflex. It's got to be an automatic response. So there's a thing called a reflex arc, and it's the neural pathway that actually controls the reflex. I'm going to need you all to understand the components that happen in this reflex arc. You need to have all of these components. Mostly, we'll talk about the change here in just a minute, in order for a reflex to occur. If you didn't have sensory neurons, for example, you're not going to have a reflex to something because there's nothing to pick up the sense for your brain to interpret and cause you to react. So you need all of these things that are in this chain. You will definitely need to know the components of this, and you will need to understand how this works. You will see quite a bit on reflexes. And then when we go into muscles, you're going to use a lot of this information and tie it together with what we're talking about here. So there are a couple of different types of reflexes. There are monosynaptic reflexes, and they have no interneuron. So it's pretty much a straight shot of information. So if you look at that reflex arc path that I have going up here, you will need to know that a polysynaptic reflex has these interneurons in it. A monosynaptic reflex does not. So you have a sensory receptor, a neuron, and then it goes to a motor neuron and then to an effector organ. So that interneuron does not come into play. There are also di and trisynaptic reflexes. We are really not going to go into those. You can sort of just from their name figure out a little bit about what they do, but you don't need to focus on it for this particular course. Now, that being said, you do need to understand how reflexes work, how the information is traveling. So say, for example, you have, this is a skin drawing here, and you have some kind of stimulus that occurs on your skin. Like say you put your hand out on a hot stove. The sensory receptors in your hand will pick it up and it will conduct using action potentials to the nerve and into the dorsal root. So remember, dorsal is the backside of something. So the impulse will travel in the dorsal root. It will go through the dorsal root ganglion. You only have these in the dorsal root, by the way, because it's meant to receive and send sensory information. It travels into the dorsal root. In the case of a polysynaptic reflex, it gets to this gray matter. It synapses with the interneuron. It sends the message up to your brain. Your brain sends out an efferent signal. Remember, efferent is exit. It will go through your brain, be sent back down through the gray matter. And then here you get the impulse, the efferent impulse that will come out of the gray matter, travel through the ventral root, and it will travel back out to your effector organ. So the organ that actually has something that it needs to do. And if you think about it, it is really flipping amazing how quickly our nerves transmit these impulses, especially with the complication of what it takes to send an action potential, how quickly everything's moving. So I want you to take a minute and go back to that portion, I think it was in the chapter 11 lecture, where we talk about A, B, and C type nerves and how quickly things travel through them. And as you're going through reflexes, I want you to stop and think, well, what kind of conduction could be happening here? How big is the actual path for the action potential to go through? So actually, now that I've talked about it, that is primarily what you're going to need to understand about how these reflexes work, is that you get a sensory receptor, picks up your signal, goes through the dorsal root ganglion, sends it to the gray matter. Now, in the case of a monosynaptic reflex, if you notice, I said there is no interneuron in a monosynaptic reflex. Mono equals 1. So in this case, it gets to the gray matter, and that afferent signal travels directly to the brain. The brain translates it, decides what needs to be done, sends an efferent signal back down through the gray matter. It comes out and passes through the ventral root on the way back out. I am not going to ask you nearly as much as I would because I tend to spend a little, I think an entire lecture on this particular topic, but I really need you to understand the basics of this and where that signal is traveling. It is very important as you move forward, both for understanding muscles and everything else you're going to do. So be sure that you could draw this and you could label these things and tell me what's going through where. All right, so the stretch reflex is the first one that we want to cover. So your muscles will contract in response to a stretching force applied to them. So it doesn't have an interneuron, which makes it a monosynaptic reflex. This is really important because you need to be able to respond to too much stretching. You don't want your muscles to just tear because they just keep stretching and you don't have a reflex to cause that muscle to contract again. So we talk about muscle spindles. Make sure that you understand what they are at this point. Have a really rudimentary understanding because we're going to go extremely in depth with this idea of muscle spindles when we get to chapter 9 and 10 here in a week or so. So the muscle spindles actually are what respond to stretch. So if you see down here, you see these green threads that are sensory neurons, and they wrap around the muscle just like if you were to wrap a thread around a partially inflated balloon. And then when you inflate the balloon, the thread will stretch and press into the balloon. Well, that thread actually is your body's way of measuring the tension in that muscle. So in the last lecture that I put up for you, I talked about neural fibers, and down the road we will talk about how muscle fibers tend to congregate in those same clusters. So that really plays a large role in this. Just think about those threads as knowing whether or not something is stretching. All right, so those muscle spindles actually will detect the stretch of the muscle, if you see. And then the sensory neurons send action potentials to the spinal cord. And look where it goes. It's going to go through that dorsal root ganglion. It's going to go through the dorsal root ganglion into the gray matter. And then that information, once it gets there, is going to shoot straight up to the brain. So then once that signal that efferent signal comes from the brain, you wind up the information goes back through the ventral root, and then the alpha motor neurons come into play. They conduct action potentials straight to the muscle, and that forces it to contract to keep the muscle from stretching any further. And then the gamma motor neurons come into play, and they actually, how do I want to put this without being confusing? The gamma motor neurons affect the muscle spindle itself. So it causes the muscle spindle to contract. So remember I said that that muscle spindle is how, and its stretching and contraction is how your brain reads exactly the tension that is on that muscle. Well, the gamma motor neurons, after you've had that reflex, the gamma motor neurons tell the spinal cord that the muscle is contracting. So it forces the muscle to contract, and that is how it protects itself. So make sure if there's any question about that, I can answer more questions. You don't necessarily need to know, let me see, you don't necessarily need to know. I had somebody ask me a question about extension versus retraction and how that changes the motion of the leg in each condition. I wouldn't worry too much about that per se. I may have just misunderstood the question, and it's maybe based on what it's showing here with the patellar tendon and how it connects to the bone in the lower portion of the leg. I wish I had a way to show you this demonstration. I'm going to have to think about how to give you the actual demonstration of that. I need a few little props here. Hopefully I can get that together and show you, and unfortunately I'll have to make a second video, but we can see what I can do about that. So this is your stretch reflex. The whole purpose of it is to make it so that your muscle does not just keep stretching until it tears. Oh, wrong way. All right, so the Golgi tendon organ is actually, it is not the Golgi body. Do not let that throw you off. I am almost certain it was probably named after the same person who found the Golgi body. It's not a name you hear very often, but they're nerve endings that are encapsulated that are in the tendon near muscle. So you will find these anywhere, almost everywhere, tendon actually meets the muscle. And this is reaction that is similar to the stretch reflex and its purpose. Its purpose is to prevent damage to the tendons that can be caused by excessive tension. So before we were talking about damage to the muscle because of excessive tension. Now we're talking about a way to protect the tendons from excessive tension. So what this organ does is it causes a sudden relaxation of the muscle. So the example that we have here is actually a pretty good one. I don't know if you all have had any time or any interest even in watching some of the, let me pull this up here. There we go. Okay, and watching competitive lifting. But they lift these ridiculous amounts of weight, and we're talking about like the clean and jerk. And if you guys know, you grab the bar, of course not here, you grab it closer to the ground, and you lift it, and then you snap it up like this, and then when they push it above their head, they tend to take one big step forward with their foot. So they're actually changing the position of their body. So here's the thing, and this is a really cool reflex. If the weight is too much, if during that shift where they pick up the weight and they step forward, if they lean back too far, they can put way too much tension on their Achilles tendon. And you guys know where that is, right there near the ankle at the very back of your foot. So if they step back too far and put too much tension on that Achilles tendon, they go, their hands open, which I think is really cool. So your body literally is forcing them to get rid of the weight by snapping their hands open because they could rip their Achilles tendon. It took me a minute to wrap my head around this, that's something going on down there. can affect or does affect something up here, like the brain is registering, hey, it's weight causing that, let it go. But that's what the Golgi tendon reflex is. So make sure that you know that the Golgi tendon organ detects the tension that is applied to a tendon. The sensory neurons that detect that tension conduct action potential straight to the spinal cord, which hopefully you figured out it goes through the dorsal root. And it goes through the dorsal root into the spinal cord. It synapses with interneurons that then feed to the alpha motor neurons that we just talked about. So when you inhibit the alpha motor neurons, this is where those EPSPs and IPSPs come into play. When you inhibit the alpha motor neurons, it causes muscle relaxation. So when the muscle relaxes, you're not putting as much tension on that tendon, right? So in the case of the weightlifter, this is a little bit annoying, there we go. In the case of the weightlifter, the muscle relaxation is actually in their fingers and in their hands. And that pulls the weight off of that tendon because they've dropped the weight that's causing the problem. So that is the Golgi tendon reflex. Okay, the withdrawal reflex also follows a similar route. It has the interneurons because it is a polysynaptic reflex. And I've answered questions in the discussion board. I also feel like in one of the lectures, I talked about reciprocal innervation. But the withdrawal reflex is the one that you think about the most. You put your hand on a hot stove and, you know, it's your body responding to a painful stimulus. Get your hand off that stove. It's really important that you have the withdrawal reflex. So for example, like my mother had back surgery and they had to sever a number of nerves when they did it. So that meant that she couldn't feel for the longest time any of the feeling basically from her waist down. She could walk, but all of the sensory, the skin sensation, like it was just gone. So she could lean into something, literally, she could get stabbed in the leg and not know that it had happened, not know to pull away. She'd have no kind of reflex. She could literally just lean into something and not know that it was causing damage. So the withdrawal reflex is extremely important. So the whole point of it is to get your body away from the thing that is causing pain, because pain equals damage. Pain equals something is not right. So reciprocal innervation is the first kind of withdrawal reflex, and it causes the extensor muscle to relax and the flexor muscle to contract. This sort of plays a role in the stretch reflex as well, but reciprocal innervation, the best way to remember it is if you take your arm and you put it out and you tighten your bicep and your tricep at the same time. And when you're tightening both of those, try and move your arm. It doesn't really go very far because you need one muscle group relaxed and its antagonizing muscle group contracted in order to make those sort of movements. So that reciprocal innervation causes you to pull away, but in order to do that, it's got to contract one set and relax the other. So give it a try, kind of hold your arm out there or do it with your leg, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, the cross extensor reflex is a withdrawal reflex that is in a lower limb. So our body spends an amazing amount of resources and time to keep us as bipeds from falling over. And this is another one of those situations. So the cross extensor reflex is initiated when you have to rapidly lift a foot off the ground. You need to straighten out the leg that is still on the ground or you're going to fall over. So say I am walking across the room and I step on a thumbtack with my left foot. Well, my left foot is immediately going to have the reflex that it's going to try and pull my foot off of that thumbtack, But if my right leg does not straighten out for me to balance and stand on, I'm going to fall down. So that is where this crossed extensor reflex comes into play. And it's the same exact type of situation. The major difference here is, let me see if I can show you, if this is a good picture for it. I actually don't really like this picture of it very much. You've got your stimulus sensory neuron. This is just the reciprocal innervation. I need to find you guys the crossed extensor reflex because you actually have to move the information from one side of the spinal cord to the other side of the spinal cord, which is what makes it so different. Let me see if the next slide. All right, here we go. We might have it. So here is the reciprocal innervation, and make sure that you understand the steps that happen here. It looks a little bit different from the other ones, but if you pay attention, it's actually the same thing. It's just drawn a little bit differently. So make sure that you sit down and you kind of draw like as close to a leg as you can get, and be able to draw where this is traveling, where the sensory neurons are activated, that they're traveling through the dorsal root. Make sure you know that, and that you know all of which neurons are activated when. So alpha versus gamma, which I talked to you about, I think 2 slides ago. All right, here we go. This is much, much better. Let me, okay. All right, so here is the major difference with this crossed extensor reflex. If you notice, the sensory information still travels in the same way. They interact and they synapse with these interneurons that are part of the withdrawal reflex. They continue, or they stimulate the alpha motor neurons just like the others, and force that limb to withdraw. So far, so good. We are across doing the same thing. Now, in step 4 here, the branches of the sensory neurons also have an extra synapse. They synapse with excitatory neurons that cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord. This is what makes it that crossed extensor reflex, because you've got the signal. Yes, the signal is going to the brain, but also we need to get that information over to the other leg. So step 4 is where the major difference is with this particular one. So if you get all the other reflexes that I talked about and you understand it, you need to add 1 step to the crossed extensor reflex and you will have it down. This is, okay, this is a really good example of something that you want to be able to teach someone. I would actually take a little longer than what I've done, and I would go ahead and fill in the details. Use the proper terminology, practice with yourself, draw a picture, trace the lines, label all the things as you go through. Those are the things that you're going to need to know. You're going to see this reflex thing again. You're going to see the muscle spindles again. You're going to have that very, very shortly. So I recommend you go ahead and put it all together, put all that information together now, maybe WebEx or Zoom or however, with people in your classroom, and teach each other these different reflexes. This is the perfect time for that thing that I've been recommending all semester. I'd do it now. Okay. So this is just a little slide going over interactions with the actual spinal cord reflexes. So you've seen this. Okay, you've seen this. This just goes into a little bit more detail. The signal goes through these tracts. So a tract is essentially It's got fluid in it, but if you just imagine it like a tunnel, so that it's pretty much a direct shot with minimal things getting in the way as that signal ascends or descends from the brain. So in some of the other slides, it breaks it down into three types of tracts, which I will expect you to know, but then it briefly mentions the different regions inside of each tract. You do not need that at that point of time, at this point in time. However, just this is a portion that ties into all of those things that I already showed you. So your sensory information ascends a tract to the brain and it descends a tract back down to where that signal came in and sends the signal out to the effector organ. The only thing I need you to know about EPSPs and IPSPs is that there are certain neurotransmitters that can modify the reflex. So remember what I talked to you about in Chapter 11, and please refer to Chapter 11 because I spent probably about 5 minutes on the EPSP, IPSP slide. I don't necessarily expect you, I told you you're not going to need to know all of these neurotransmitters. That is a completely different course, but you need to know what excitatory and what inhibitory means. So you need to go back and look at your action potential information and see how that would go about modifying a reflex. So this is not new information. Just make sure that you understand it before moving forward. And I think that that might be the last one. Yes. So that's the last slide. It took about 30 minutes and I actually managed to cover all I really need you to know about how information is traveling for now. I'm not going to make it as complicated as it has been before. I kind of look through what you're going to need. This is good for now. You're not missing much. We've given you plenty of other stuff to help you tie all this together. But all of this information is that big picture stuff. Get the process in your head. Like you have a body of your own. You can kind of like think of what your muscles are doing when you flex and contract and extend things. So take the time to understand the big picture and then fill all the details in that go under it. There's so much in this chapter that is memorization. And I hate that, but I told you at the beginning, like you're learning a new language, there's going to be a lot of it. But this section absolutely is not memorization. There are a few terms that you're going to need to learn that go with this material, but this is big picture, talk it out, draw pictures kind of material. So please do not study this the way you are studying your spinal nerves. This is totally different. This is a different method you should use. If you have any questions at all, let me know. Go ahead and keep adding to Chapter 12 discussion if you'd like. I am going to start up a quick run-through lecture of Chapter 13 and 14, and I'll have that up for you as soon as I can. Okay, you guys, well, thanks for listening, and I hope this was very helpful for you.